name is Miss Maureen, and today I'm going to be showing you the Fogg Homestead. This is the house that the Fogg family lived in the 1800s. It was built by William Fogg between the years of 1819 and 1821. Although this land actually belonged to the Fogg family since 1680. For much of the 20th century, until the year 2000, this house was rented out to a variety of residents who lived in it as their home. But unfortunately, in October of 2000, the house was victim to arson, which means that somebody set it on fire on purpose. Thankfully, no one was injured, but the house was damaged. All of the rooms suffered fire damage, and the L, which is this section of the building right behind me, was completely destroyed. This led to the house being restored to its original 1821 condition. During the restoration, this section was rebuilt in honor of Juliette C. Wister, who was a former librarian of the Fogg Library. Restoration was completed in 2005, and we began to make requests for donations to furnish the house. So much of what you'll see in the rest of the building never belonged to the Fogg family, but it is representative of the type of furniture and the type of objects that they would have had in their house during the 1800s. This room, the Juliette C. Wister room, is the most modern room in the house, although we do have a couple of historic items that actually belong to the Fogg family in this room. A couple of things like Betsy Deed Hill's wedding slippers. She was married to William Fogg. Some of John Fogg's equipment that he used as a doctor, as well as William's collection of books. We also have this 175-year anniversary quilt. This quilt depicts lots of different historic buildings that existed in 1810. So you won't see the Fogg house or the library on this quilt, as they both came after that time. This room is called the long room. We're not completely sure what this room was used for during the Fogg family's time here, but perhaps it was used as a place to greet informal guests, or a place to read, or gather as a family, or a place for crafting. What do you think this room was used for? Off the side of the long room is the scullery. This room is the scullery. This room was typically colder than the rest of the house, so this is where they would cook in the summer, and also where they stored items such as grains and other dry foods, and their kitchen appliances. And I bet you're wondering what kind of appliances they had in the 1800s. Well, they definitely didn't have toasters, they didn't have microwaves, but they did have butter churners, which they would use to make butter. They had cheese keepers that would keep cheese fresh. They had apple parers, and they had their ice box. An ice box is like an old-fashioned refrigerator. It was used to keep perishable foods safe to eat. An ice box kind of looked like a wooden cupboard, and they would take a huge chunk of ice and put it inside of the box and cover it in sawdust so it didn't melt very fast. And that's where they would store their perishable food. This room is the main kitchen. This is where they do most of their cooking. And this fireplace here is extra special because it acts as the stove, as the oven, and as the heater for the house. Inside the fireplace, there is the fireplace hook. And this is where they hang different pots and different kettles, and they use the fire to cook the food in those pots. The arm can swing out or in to control how much heat the food is getting. Then there are these little squares on the side of the fireplace. These act as a sort of oven. Because there's so much heat generated by the fireplace, the bricks get warmed up, and then you can insert something inside to bake it. Does anybody know what this is? It's a bedpan. So because the house didn't have heating, it would get very cold in the winter. So instead, families would heat rocks up in the fireplace, fill the bedpan with the hot rocks, and then put those underneath their bedding in order to warm their beds before sleeping. In this room, we also have a couple different items that you might have seen in a kitchen in the 1800s. And some of these things might look very familiar to you. Mixing bowls, spatulas and spoons for mixing, cheese graters, butter keepers, and little pots for baking. This might not look so familiar to you. This is a flax wheel. Back in the 1800s, people had to make their own threads because they sewed their own clothing and bedding. This wheel made it possible to spin thread from the fibers found in a flax plant. So it's very useful to have a flax wheel in your house. One more thing I'd like to look at in this room before we leave is the stitching up here. This is actually done by a little girl named Abigail Libby, who was 8 years old, all the way back in 1811. Stitching is something that they would do for fun, or to sell, or to make their homes just a happier, more beautiful place. Let's take a moment to go over the Fogg family history. William Fogg was born in 1790, and he grew to local importance as a historian and a prominent genealogist. Officially, he worked as the town clerk of Eliot and the first official postmaster. William Fogg loved to collect books. In a time when most families had no books in their home, aside from the Bible, William Fogg managed to amass his own personal library. The books that we saw in the Juliette Wister room, as well as the books here, were part of William's personal collection. William, along with Andrew Layton, Andrew Fernald, and Benjamin Kennard, came together to create the Eliot Social Library Association. Their collection, which was made up of books from William's collection as well as the other members, was housed in various locations. It moved from one member's house to another, and for a time it was kept in this very house. In 1821, William married Betsy Deed Hill. Together they had 5 children, although sadly only one of them made it to adulthood. 2 died in infancy. Rebecca died at age 19 from tuberculosis, and William Ansell died at the age of 25. The only one of their children to survive to the age of adulthood was John. And we'll talk more about John when we go upstairs. For now, let's talk about the parlor. This room was used to accept formal guests. You can tell that it was decorated with much nicer furniture than the rest of the house. This room was meant to impress people. They would have had nicer furniture as well as nicer decorations. For example, the glassware. This particular set wouldn't have been around during William or John's time. It's a little bit later than them, but it's an example of the type of decoration that would be shown off in the parlor. This particular set is Mary Gregory glassware. She was very famous in the late 19th century, specifically for her depiction of Victorian-era children. Some other things that would have been present in a parlor in the 1800s were things for entertainment, such as musical instruments. You might recognize this instrument as a violin, but do you have any idea what this one is called? It looks like a piano, but it's not quite a piano. It's called a pump or pedal organ. The way it worked was by pumping the pedals with your feet, which would cause air to vibrate a thin metal sheet called a reed, which would make sounds. These were much, much cheaper than the massive pipe organs you'd find in huge churches or cathedrals. So in the 1800s, you found a lot of pump organs in homes and in churches. Something else of note in this room are the minutes from one of the meetings of the Eliot Social Library Club. These were written by Sarah Farmer, who was another famous Eliot resident. These minutes were written after William Fogg's time, but they are still an interesting insight into what was being discussed. And finally, the last thing of interest in this room is a portrait over here of Francis Joseph Fogg. He is the youngest son of Dr. John Fogg, so he was William's grandson. Let's go upstairs to check out the bedrooms. This room is Rebecca's room. Remember, Rebecca was William's daughter, who tragically passed away at the age of 19. And we don't know for a fact that Rebecca stayed in this room, but we have decorated it in a way that would showcase how a young woman might decorate her room in the 1800s. You can see from the fancy hairpins, the jewelry boxes, the opera glasses, and the delicate statuettes, as well as the sewing machine. This sewing machine is operated by a pump, much like the pump organ downstairs, so it did require a little bit of work, but it was certainly much easier than sewing by hand. And remember, in the 1800s, families couldn't just pop by Target in order to buy new sheets or new clothes. They had to make everything by hand. So a sewing machine was a great blessing to have in your home. In this room, we have an example of a rope bed. So on this bed, underneath the mattress, there are ropes going from one side of the frame to the other. These are used to support the mattress, but they do need to be tightened every night in order to make sure that the mattress stays firm and that the person sleeping in the bed gets a comfortable night's sleep. That's where the term sleep tight comes from. Some other things that you would find in a bedroom in the 1800s were the wash basin, because they didn't have running water in the 1800s. So if they wanted to wash up before bed or after waking up, they would need to have a little basin and a pitcher of water in order to do that with. Something else that was very important to have in a bedroom was the chamber pot. Do you know what a chamber pot was used for? Well, remember, they didn't have running water, so they didn't have plumbing, they didn't have a toilet like we have them. They would often have to go outside to use the bathroom in an outhouse. But in the middle of the night, especially in a winter night, you don't want to be going outside. So, enter the chamber pot. You wake up in the middle of the night, you have to use the bathroom, you go in the pot. And then you just empty it in the morning. It's a little gross to think about now, but it was definitely much better than going outside in the middle of the night. One other thing I want to point out is the trunk at the foot of the bed. This would give extra storage and also be used for traveling. This is the kids' room. Again, we're not certain that children slept here when the Fogg family lived here, but we've decorated it in a way that would have represented a child's room in the 1800s. You'll notice the bed is dressed with some hand-stitched bedding. There's also a hand-stitched quilt and some hand-stitched bedclothes. These are the sort of things that you would have found in a household during the 1800s. There's also lots of children's toys in this room. A little ball puzzle game, a dollhouse, some stuffed animals, although these are clearly not from the 1800s, and a tea set. These are things that we still play with today. On the bedside table, there is a Bible. And remember, we said downstairs that although William Fogg had his own extensive personal library, most families would have only had a Bible in their house for some bedtime reading. No picture books, no storybooks, just one Bible. That's why it's so special that William founded first the Eliot Social Library Association, and then later John founded the public library for the whole town of Eliot in honor of his father, William. Let's talk a little bit more about John Fogg. John Fogg went to school number 5 and later Eliot Academy before attending Bowdoin College. After graduating in 1846, he studied to become a doctor at Harvard Medical School. He became a practicing doctor in 1850
in South Boston, where he lived and married his wife, Sarah Frances Gordon. They had 3 kids, William John, Francis Joseph, who was in the portrait downstairs, and Charles. Unfortunately, just like with William's family, only one of their kids lived to adulthood. In 1875, John became paralyzed and began using a wheelchair. He gave up working on medicine and instead focused on his other passion, history. He and his second wife, Mary Griselda Clinch, who was known as one of the premier historians of the time, dedicated their time to collecting, cataloging, and preserving historical documents, such as old signatures and letters of famous people. By the time they finished their collection, they had the signatures of every single one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, as well as every king and queen of England dating back to Henry VII. When John Fogg died in 1896 at the age of 70, he left a will and a trust that bequeathed his land, his house, and all of his money to his wife and his adult son, and that stated that upon their deaths, all of that would go to the town of Eliot for the purpose of creating a public library. When his son William died without any heirs, followed shortly by his wife Mary, all of John Fogg's legacy passed on to the town of Eliot. With the land and the trust left by Dr. John Fogg, Eliot was able to establish a public library in the name of John's father, a scholar, a historian, and a book lover, William Fogg.